Hey everybody, welcome to another Majestic INFJ video. Hoping to continue on the other two videos I posted last night dealing with the role of extroverted feeling, or FE, and in particular in the INFJ. And we're gonna dig a little deeper maybe into it in this video, and maybe tackle some of the questions that you might have that the other videos raised. So again, with this video and the other videos, I sort of assume that you've got some working knowledge or rough knowledge of the cognitive functions and generally how they work and how they stack up in the various MBTI types, and in particular in the INFJ. So the INFJ, as we've talked about, its secondary function is extroverted feeling, which people refer to as the tool function in socionics and whatnot. And what we talked about was how you want to sort of frame the way that you think about FE, because my argument is that it's sort of a more all-encompassing function, or sort of a broader function than people typically describe it. I'd argue that, again, what it's doing is it's a goal-oriented function. In psychology, we call this basically your executive function. It controls goal-oriented behavior, getting you from point A to point B and figuring out all the steps in between. And this is actually a very well-known function in cognitive psychology, and in the neuroscience world, they've actually differentiated two different parts of the brain. They're very close to each other, but they're separate brain systems with separate connections. And one of the connections, which I think you'll have to check in, it's the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. So it's right, sitting right up here. And it's in control of general executive functions. So typically what you'd probably think of as TE. So executive functions that have to do with systems, abstract systems that are not social, or objects, or things in the physical domain that are not social, okay, or related to humans. And then there's also a part in the brain which is the medial lateral prefrontal cortex, and that has been shown to be linked specifically to social types of behavior, so social executive function, so interacting with people, and again, sort of goal-oriented behaviors, trying to get, from point A to point B and figuring out the steps along the way, but in the social domain. And as we touched upon last night, you could see why there would be two different systems, because the physical world and objects tend to stay pretty static. So once you figure a system out, you can pretty much go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4 without very much changing. Sometimes things might change and you have to adapt your system, or your representation of the system in your head, but by and large things stay pretty constant and very linear. So the way to think of it is going from step 1 to step 2 in a very ordinal process. How do you get from point A to point B? Well, there's these various steps, and you have to go one by one in order, usually, without skipping. Social dynamics or the social domain is very different, right? It's very, I like to think of it as fluid, very non-linear. You're dealing with people, and people do not stay constant necessarily all the time. We'd love for them to, and a lot of times we sort of fall into the trap of thinking that they will, but motivations change, people can change their mind, they can decide, you could be relying on somebody to help you, with some sort of task, and some other job might come up that's better for them, or they decide they want to move, or they want to go back to school. They, just have different motivations, different incentives, and so you're constantly dealing with sort of this non-linear system where you have to keep adjusting and keep adapting, and so you could see why the brain would start differentiating the two functions into different areas, different brain systems that are sort of handling it. Now, of course, there's a lot of overlap, as you would imagine, but they are distinct. And you can get, neurological patients where they get damage to one area but not the other. And so, you might see a breakdown in their ability to do simple, non-social general tasks like washing the dishes, or repairing something that maybe otherwise they might have been able to before, or on the flip side, you could see somebody with damage to the medial part, which affects the social interactions, and they have breakdowns in dealing with social interactions and social executive function. So they could still do the dishes, they could still drive their car, they can still do, various other executive operational tasks in the TE domain, but you see a breakdown in the FE domain. At least that's what I would argue, in sort of using Jungian terminology and MBTI terminology. So, really just want to point that out, because it's not like, this is just coming out of nowhere. There's actually physical and, scientific, objective, empirical data out there that shows the difference between these two systems. And so you can see how it maps on to, what Carl Jung and Myers and Briggs and, and the socionics folks and everybody has sort of, grabbed onto this concept of thinking versus feeling. I would call it more sort of object-oriented versus social-oriented, but that's the way to think about it. So going back specifically to FE, so what do we, so again, I'd like to sort of talk about the way that FE is typically described in the typology community, particularly, when you take the online tests and you get this sort of description of somebody who's a, heavy FE user, like an ENFJ or ESFJ, or even an INFJ and ISFJ, where FE is sort of in the first or secondary function. And again, you tend to get these descriptions of it as that are sort of more linked to behavior, or maybe character attributes, right? So for example, the example I keep using is, you see this all the time, where FE is considered to be a function focused on consensus building or building harmony within a group. And yes, that might be something that it does, and it might do it a lot, but I would say that's more of a tactic that it's using, or maybe even a strategy, but it's not it doesn't describe the whole picture, okay? Other people have referred to it as sort of a perception management tool. Again, I think that's right. I think, if you're trying to, if you're trying to control or influence people and their perception of you, right? So you want them to like you, or you want them to respect you, or you want them to see you as an authority or competent or logical or whatever the case may be. You want them to have some sort of perception of you. Yes, that would be a very FE type of thing, and probably within the FE domain. But again, I think that's a tactic. I think that's something that FE will turn on in order to, operate its overall function, and that's to get you to achieve your goal. And so again, as we talked about in the other video, any sort of goal-oriented system is going to have three components. It's going to have the objective, what's the goal in mind. It's going to have the strategy, what's the overall game plan from getting from point A to point B at a kind of a high level. Which direction do I, general direction am I going to go here? And then you have the tactical component, and that's sort of the step-by-step process, right? So, in order to get from point A to point B, there's going to be various steps along the way, and I've got to figure out what my tactics are going to be to get from step to step, okay? And that's pretty much what FE is doing. Now, is it doing it on its own? Certainly not. I mean, what these executive functions are doing, when you look at sort of the biology or the neuroscience literature, is the way to think about it is, these front parts of the brain that are doing, quote unquote, doing the executive function. So what they're really doing is they're sort of searching your database back here in the rest of your brain. As you learn new information or acquire new information, you build up this sort of database in your head, and the executive function areas are sort of searching through that database. And they're doing it really through an inhibitory process. So they're sort of inhibiting things that aren't relevant and allowing the things that are relevant to sort of activate. So a very complicated process. Of course, nobody really knows how it works, but that's just sort of a high level description of it. So sort of think about, if you've got a database or like an Excel sheet or something, and you have to search through and find information relevant to whatever goal you're working on, there's some sort of searching function or some sort of executive function to extract the data out. Now, we'll probably get into this in more detail in other videos, but think of your database, think of yourself as having two databases. You've got your SI database, and that's your knowledge, and then you've got your NI database, right? So SI, NI, and both of them are sort of knowledge-based systems, and you could kind of think of them as your database of information. And SI is based off of experience. What have you experienced, and what kind of information have you picked up along the way due to your experiences? And that could be, just sort of what your house looks like, what your car looks like, your car's color, or other things like, rules, how you're, the best way to do your laundry, that kind of stuff, experience along the way. You sort of just built up this database of information that's spread across your brain in different domains. And then NI, I would argue, is your database of knowledge that's not based off of experience, right? So it's knowledge that you have that isn't based off of direct experience. And so it's more of like inductive reasoning, right? So little, facts about the world or observations about the world that you've sort of put together based off, generally based off your experience, but you haven't directly experienced it, right? So I guess, for example, if you are dating somebody and you drive by that person's ex-boyfriend's house and you see your girlfriend's car parked in the driveway, now you didn't directly see your girlfriend at the house, but your intuition sort of put two and two together, and you can just sort of assume she was there. Now, there might be, some excuse or some reason why the car was there and she wasn't. Maybe a friend borrowed it. Who knows? But intuitively, you sort of do this inductive reasoning, and you sort of decide, okay, I know she was there. That kind of intuitive knowledge. Now, of course, there might be other examples where it's not as circumstantial, and you're able to come up with some sort of intuitive knowledge that is maybe less questionable, whether or not it's true or not, that kind of thing. So two different systems or databases of knowledge where your executive functions are pulling out information that it's going to use, right? So why am I getting into this? Well, the reason is because when we talk about FE, we tend to sort of loosely talk about it doing different things like, figuring out hierarchies of people, right? So if you've got some social task that needs to be done and you need to rely on a group of people, you need to figure out, okay, which role is everybody going to play, and what's the hierarchy, who reports to whom, and all that kind of stuff. Now, FE is responsible for doing that, but of course it's relying on information that you've acquired over the years and whatnot with your database of knowledge, right? It's not just doing it in a vacuum. So when we talk about things like building up hierarchies or reading people or figuring out what role people can play or what box to put them in, it's not just FE doing it alone, it's FE interacting with your knowledge base, right? And there could be other things that FE is interacting with. For example, it could be interacting with your extroverted sensing and picking up, sort of social cues in the here and now on whether or not, what you're trying is working, right? So if you walk into the conference room and you're all jazzed up about some project you're working on, and you need all the people in the conference room to sort of, buy into what you're trying to accomplish, and they're all just sort of sitting there and they're on their phone and they're just completely disinterested in what's going on. Your FE is going to sort of read that, right? And your SE is going to read that. And again, what your FE is doing is it's focusing your SE stuff on things relevant to your goal, right? So think about it this way. If you're the one that is trying to get everybody jazzed up about this new project, and it's your job to get everybody into sort of a coherent operating system, your FE is going to, your FE system is going to focus your SE sensory input on things related to the goal that you're working on, right? That's what your executive function does, is it inhibits all the information that isn't relevant to your goal process, and it focuses you on what is relevant, right? So this is all attention. This is all like where, in your brain are different things sort of taking the conscious spotlight and focusing. And so if your goal is to get everybody on board and your SE is picking up these vibes from everybody, and maybe your FI too, right? I mean, your FI is going to be dragged along, in this process as well. And your FI is going to sort of pick up on, the general sense, the general vibes. The SE is going to pick up on, who's on their phone, not really paying attention, who showed up late, all that kind of sensory input that you might have otherwise ignored if you had a different goal in mind, right? If your goal was, hey, we just have to do these meetings because, our boss tells us we've got to meet every week. So let's just, sit here for 15 minutes and then we'll all go back and do our job. And you don't have this sort of FE goal in mind. You might not pick up on all that stuff. You might not pay attention to it, right? And so sort of backing up, and I realize that's a lot of information all at once, but backing up, your FE is, so when we talk about FE doing these things, it's doing it in the sense of it's sort of coordinating among your other functions, right? And figuring out and using those other functions, your database of your knowledge, the input of information that's coming in, your general FI vibe about people and their situation and whether or not things are going well or going poorly, all of that stuff, and then TI stuff, right? Whether or not, you're logically what you're trying to do makes sense, right? Is it logical to rely on somebody who is really good at their job but is quitting in a week, right? Can they do everything that needs to be done within a week? Is that sort of a logical conclusion to make? That would be sort of a TI type of determination. And so, all these systems are sort of working together, but FE is sort of pulling them along and running the show, okay? And so, again, something to keep in mind when we talk about what FE is quote unquote doing. It's certainly, like I said, it's running the show. It's the executive functioning, it's running the executive function, right? And controlling the other functions towards this sort of goal-oriented behavior. And so when you see things like FE is involved in harmony building, or perception management, or, displaying emotions and stuff, yeah, it that's part of what it's doing, but it's only doing it because those are the little tactics that it decides work, right? And so if you're trying to convince somebody to do something, and that's usually what's happening in the social domain, is you need some goal achieved and you can't necessarily do it all by yourself, and so you need to convince other people to help you, either help you or give you permission, right? That's basically the two things you're doing in the social domain, either trying to get help or trying to get permission. And either way, during your lifetime, and maybe even, it might be just sort of ingrained innate, behavior in humans, is you've developed these little tactics, or you have these little tactics ingrained in you on how to get people to do what you want them to do, either give you permission or give you help. And things like being nice and building harmony, or presenting yourself as competent and reassured, and I'm an authority on this. You can trust me. I know what I'm doing. I'm an expert. All that is sort of FE like management, because again, you can't get to your overall goal without convincing people to either help you or give you permission, or basically to work with you on this. And so those are definitely all the little tactics, but it's but again, sometimes those tactics don't work. Sometimes building harmony isn't going to achieve your goals. Sometimes you need to get permission from somebody who's just being unreasonable, or just being an asshole about the situation, and so you might have to be more of a, more pushy, more of a nag, to basically get what you're after. Same thing with getting people to help you. Sometimes sometimes being nice and being comforting, doesn't get them off their butt to help you. And it might even have the exact opposite effect where, if you're too nice, they might not want to, they might just sort of assume you'll do it, right? Rather than ruffling everybody's feathers. And one thing I kind of wanted to point out, and maybe I'll get into this more in another video, but the typology community tends to be pretty young. People who are sort of in their late teens, early 20s, that sort of time of your life where you're sort of figuring out who you are and noticing that, there are differences and, sort of unique things about yourself, but also things that you share with other people. Just sort of this journey of self-reflection and figuring out your identity. That's what sort of attracts people to this, or the whole typology community and MBTI and all that. And and a lot of times when you're thinking about FE, you're sort of thinking about it in your own personal life. And because you're younger, you probably haven't been in too many situations where you have to sort of get people, basically boss people around or manage people. Maybe a little at work, maybe a little at school. You might have been like a, class president or president of the chess club or something like that, where you had to manage people. But in general, you probably can sort of rely on other people to help you, that are maybe a little older and more experienced. But as you get older, this sort of management function starts developing a little bit more. And so the reason I point this out is because when you're younger and you're first getting into MBTI, you tend to think of FE more in the sense of sort of this emotional spot or this emotional function of, basically trying to get people to like you, trying to fit in, trying to create harmony. And that's probably because, out of the two things FE does, either getting permission or getting people to help you, you're more relying on, at your age, getting permission on things. And it usually comes from a family member or a friend, somebody where you have a close connection with. And so, there tends to be this overlap of emotion and connection with your FE process. But as you get older, you start sort of separating out the two, and as you're sort of working with people in the business world and in various jobs and just sort of in the community, you start separating out, your emotional reaction, sort of your FI part of things from the FE parts of things, right? Yeah, you like to build connections with people, you want them to like you and everything, but at the end of the day, you just sort of want everybody to kind of do their job. And, you'll appeal to their reason, you'll appeal to their sense of authority, things like that, as you try to persuade them, but there won't be so much of an emotional overlap, right? And the reason I point that out is because, again, as you're sort of getting into this, and especially if you're younger, you sort of conflate FI with FE a lot of times, right? Because there's usually so much overlap because the people that you are interacting with, you have some sort of emotional connection to. But again, as you sort of progress in the world, you're gonna, you won't have as much of an emotional connection to people that you work with, or, have to get some sort of project done, or think, people in your community, that kind of thing. And you'll start seeing how these two functions are really different. And FE is not as emotionally laden as you might think it is. And I think that could also sort of help people who are sort of struggling with, am I an FI type or am I an FE type? You know, if it has to do with emotion, you're probably more of an FI type. So, you know, just a few, I don't know, observations. Okay, I think this has gone long enough. I appreciate you sticking with it, but I'll get back into it and, you know, maybe dig a little deeper into this executive function process. But the point of this video is to just say, you know, look, this isn't coming out of nowhere. There really are empirical data out there that show the difference between basically a TE process, goal-oriented executive function process, and a FE, social domain goal-oriented process. And so when you're thinking of FE, think of it that way. You know, you're trying to either you're trying to get people to buy in to whatever goal you're trying to achieve, and that could be either by getting them to help you or to give you permission to do what you need to do. Okay, hope that helps, and talk to everybody later. Thanks. Bye.